Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session of the Democracy Day talks here at St. Charles Community College. And today we're really honored to have Sgt Heather Taylor with us. She is the president of the Ethical Society of Police Officers here in Missouri and is going to talk about what her organization has been doing in the St. Louis area involving law enforcement. And before we get into that, I wanted to give kind of a brief background on some of the calls for police reform that have been happening in the United States recently. Since the killing of George Floyd on May 25th of this year, there's been a series of protests, of course, and sometimes rioting in the US as a result of his killing and other shootings and assaults on persons of color by police officers here in the United States. And this is an extension of the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, which goes back to the Ferguson riots 6 years ago. And so as a continuation of that, you've seen continuing calls for reform of police in the United States, calls for people of color to be treated more fairly, more equitably by police, and more restrictions to try to prevent police brutality from occurring in the United States. And some of these reforms have included things like calling for an end to stop and frisk programs in the United States. And stop and frisk is when police officers stop a person on the street. Usually this is a young man of color, and they frisk or pat him down. And usually they do these stops on very thin rationales, like the person looked back at them in a suspicious way or had a hoodie pulled up or something like that. So they'll stop this person and do a frisk. They're usually looking for weapons in a case like this. And some police departments said they needed to do this to try to help keep handguns off the street. But these programs were often very unpopular and still are today because they target, as I said, usually young men of color. So there's a lot of times a racial bias into the way stop and frisk policies are carried out. There was a notorious policy for years in New York City where this was done, and Mayor Bill de Blasio later put it into it. But that was something that was a big issue in New York City for quite a while. There's also been calls to decriminalize or to not enforce at least laws relating to illegal drugs and sex work. That a lot of the raids and police activities that take place in large cities in the U.S. Relate to illegal drug use or illegal sex work. And the argument these are victimless crimes, which is a whole issue in and of itself. But assuming they are, the idea is police should not be using their resources on that. And if you don't have police enforcing drug laws or anti-prostitution laws as aggressively, you're going to have fewer things like the tragedy in Kentucky recently where a young woman was shot by police officers in her own home during a drug raid. You also have calls for civilian review boards in the United States, and this has been going on for a while in the US. The idea of a civilian review board is in some cases police departments may not be able to effectively police themselves and effectively discipline officers. So you set up a civilian review board. As the name suggests, a civilian review board will be made up of people who are civilians, not police officers. They may be retired or former police officers, but not current police officers. And these civilian review boards have the right to review actions taken by police officers in that community and make recommendations about potential punishments or sanctions against officers who have violated the rules in some way or violated the law. They've done this, for instance, in my own hometown of Springfield, Missouri. A lot of times these civilian review boards can be a bit toothless in that they oftentimes don't have a power to subpoena people. They can't force people to appear before them. And I can tell you the one in Springfield, Missouri has no right to actually sanction an officer. They can make a recommendation to the police chief and the mayor, but that's as far as it goes. And I know there's been at least a few cases there where they've made recommendations for at least some kind of sanction against the police officer, and it just didn't happen because the mayor and the chief of police didn't agree with the civilian review board's findings. So a lot of people who are pushing for reforms in police departments in the United States would really like civilian review boards to be set up and to actually give them some real powers, like the power to subpoena officers who are accused of wrongdoing and the right to not just recommend sanctions against officers who have violated the rules in some ways, but to actually put sanctions in place themselves. So that's another thing people have been calling for in the United States. There's also been some talk about removing or reducing the amount of liability protection that police officers currently enjoy in the United States. In just about every community and state in the US right now, police officers are protected to a large extent against liability suits against them for things they do while they're on duty. And I'm going to simplify the legal arguments and language here quite a bit, but basically what this means is if you feel your rights have been violated by a police officer and you want to sue them in court, you want to sue them in a civil court, it's very difficult to do so because basically you have to prove that the officer knew that he or she was violating the law or violating the rules when they arrested you or when they had the interaction with you. In practice, in court, that's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to prove that a police officer knew they were violating the law or violating their own internal rules when they say they made an arrest or was interacting with a person on the street in some way. So in practice, very difficult to sue police officers right now in the United States for personal wrongdoing against you. Now, some people have argued we should get rid of these rules or at least reduce them in a way that makes it easier for people to file lawsuits. Of course, police officers would say they need these kind of protections under the law. Otherwise, every time they arrest somebody and they don't like it, they're going to get sued for false arrest or something like that. So there are some good arguments for keeping those protections, but there's also some good arguments for reducing that level of protection, I think, in some cases. When you move out of calls for basic police reform, which have been going on for, well, pretty much since we've had police officers in the United States, more recently, there has been a slogan put out there to defund police in the United States. And I should say, when we're talking about demands made by protesters, by civil rights activists in the United States, they a lot of times have very different viewpoints about what should be done about police reform. And when you talk about terms like defunding the police, that can mean different things to different people. It doesn't always mean the same thing. Some people who use the term defund the police use it because they want to radically cut the police department's budgets. Other people might use the term to mean we're not going to make radical cuts, but we're going to redirect some of the money from police departments over to other institutions in government that might be helpful in reducing crime overall. So some people who talk about defunding the government, and like I said, the definition of this term can vary tremendously from individual and activist to activist or group to group. But some people who have talked about defunding the police, what they really want to do is take part of the police department's budget and use it to pay for things like rehab for drug users, for programs to help reintegrate people back into society and help them find jobs after they've been released from jail or from prison, or for increased spending on social services. And this is something that's come up a lot with this debate about police reform, police defunding. And I've heard some police officers who were interviewed agree with this point, that a lot of times police officers are asked to do things they're not really trained to handle. For instance, a person who's having a mental health episode, or a person who's taken a drug they had a bad reaction to and they're having a psychotic reaction to that drug. The idea is this might be better handled by, say, a social worker or somebody with training in counseling. In a lot of cases, it might be possible to talk this person down or to deal with the situation non-violently. Police officers oftentimes aren't trained in how to handle situations like that. They're not trained counselors, they're not trained social workers. And so we could divert some money over to these social work programs. And the idea there is when you have a person who, like I said, is having a psychotic episode because of a mental health problem or because they had a bad reaction to a drug they took, you could have these counselors, these social workers go out, speak to the person, and try to resolve the situation peacefully before police officers can get involved. And in some cases, the idea is they could deal with the situation more successfully or certainly more peacefully than police officers are, because that's not really what they're trained to do. Probably the most extreme, and I should stop for a second here and mention, most mainstream politicians have embraced the idea of police reform, but when you talk about police defunding, they usually don't agree to that. Joe Biden, who's the nominee for, of course, the Democratic Party this year for the presidency, has always been careful not to use the term police defunding and say he's against police defunding, he's for police reform. I think that because this term police defunding has a lot of different meanings to different people, Joe Biden and other progressive politicians in the US are afraid that if they embrace the term police defunding, it's going to be used against them by their Republican opponents to say, oh, well, you want to take all the money away from all the police officers in the US and leave us at the mercy of the criminals. You get the idea? So a lot of politicians, even those who support some police reform, like Joe Biden and others, they don't like to use that term police defunding because they're afraid it's going to be misunderstood by people. Probably the most extreme term that's used when it comes to police reform is police abolition. And this is something you've heard. This is a term, to be honest, usually used by more radical elements of the police reform movement. And police abolition, like police defunding, it can have different meanings to different people. Some people, when they talk about police abolition, what they mean is we should maybe fire 80% of the police officers on our force right now, rehire new people, try to train them in de-escalation, give them more bias training, and try to build a better police department kind of from the ground up. You know, fire most of the police officers on the force and to some extent just start over. The more extreme version of police abolition is just what it sounds like. Police abolition is in you don't have a police department. And there's been some articles published recently in sources like the New York Times and the Atlantic magazine, where you've had authors actually calling for just police abolition. We just don't have police officers anymore. Kind of go back to that idea of police defunding and take it even further. Counselors and social workers should work with people who have broken the rules of society and try to reintegrate them. We should use more mediation between people rather than the court system or the prisons or police departments. As a political scientist, I've got to say, when you take police abolition that far, it becomes hard to distinguish between that and anarchism. And anarchism is obviously a pretty radical political view to put out there. So I just want to do a quick introduction on the concepts of police reform, some of the calls that have been made to reform police officers and police departments in the United States. And at this point, I'd like to turn over to Sgt Taylor and let her talk about what the Ethical Society of Police has been doing here in the St. Louis area. Thanks.
So thank you guys for having me again this year. I guess I'll jump right in about the defunding of law enforcement topic. And I can tell you outright that we are not for abolishing the police, especially when you have no plan in place that's structured to let people know who they're going to call when they're a victim of a crime and how that process is going to go with making victims whole again and holding people who are committing violent acts and nonviolent acts accountable. So personally, I just kind of ignore the talk about abolishing the police. That's just my own personal perspective. As far as defunding, we look at it from the standpoint of reallocating resources. I think a lot of the topics, the terms that are being used are hot button topics. So just the words that people use sometimes can eliminate an audience that is necessary to bring to the table. And when you talk about defunding the police, it's something that's about, from our standpoint, it's about reallocating those resources. We need more conflict resolution centers. That's something that we do not have in our community. In St. Louis City, we have one. When you have landlord-tenant disputes, when you have citizens disputes about parking, a parking violation, which, you know, these things should not be police matters. You should be able to resolve this, you know, within a community should be able to resolve this without notifying the police and having us involved. When it comes to mental health issues and calls for service, someone that's a social worker, counselor, they are much better suited than we are. You know, we have 40 hours of training, and you're talking about someone with a 4-year degree versus someone with a minimum 4-year degree versus us with 40 hours of training, crisis intervention training. It's great training, but 40 hours is not enough training for us to adequately handle someone that's in a mental health crisis. And you introduce us, who are notoriously what we are there to enforce the laws. And so you introduce us to that element. And sometimes you get law enforcement, which you've seen all around the country, where we have then in turn harmed someone that was simply needing help, counseling, needing mental health services. So on the topics of defunding the police, there are a lot of things that just aren't police matters that we have had police officers handle historically. Accident calls, they're accidents for a reason. They're not criminal matters until they become a criminal matter. If someone is then found to by one of the parties to be involved in some form of maybe drunk driving, yeah, call the police then, we should be involved in. However, if it's just an accident, you hit a car, it's an accident, you know, exchange information, call your insurance companies and go on your way. It's not something that law enforcement should be involved in. Potholes in the middle of the street, why are we there? We have a whole street department in the city of St. Louis. That's what they do. We're not going to fix that pothole. So, you know, why is law enforcement called on that? Why is law enforcement called on a fire hydrant call? Why are we called to mediate conflicts in which we have no skills to do? So those are things that when people talk about reallocating or defunding the police department, it's about funding properly social services and services that are provided by the city that are not adequately funded, that are then turned over to the police to handle. You know, so that's part of the problem, I think. So. And I'm not really sure, you know, if collectively I can say that, you know, our organization is not about abolishing the police until you're a victim of a violent crime and you need help in that immediate moment. It's very difficult to tell someone to abolish the police, and we have no structure in place, no plan, no idea of how we're going to do that. We absolutely believe that there are some problems in law enforcement, and there are a lot of problems in law enforcement and officers who have no business being police officers that are within law enforcement all around the country and of course locally. We see the problems and we see what happens when you have a police department that's not accountable, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, you name it. And you see the actions which lead to what we see now, people who are out here protesting for equal rights and equal treatment by law enforcement. And we do have problems that are in place, officers that that need to be removed. So some of the things that we have done, you know, since my tenure, I've been the president for 5 years. And I'll be retiring next week, but the president of the Ethical Society of Police, we've written 2 reports, one in 2016 and one in 2020, that outlines the problems, highlight cases in particular that are problematic with police departments, whether it's racism, you know, or any other form of bias or discrimination. Those are things that we've done and presented those to our city and to our community. They're published, they're on our webpage, free for anyone to review anytime they would like. And it kind of outlines, it painstakingly outlines what the problems are within our own police department. And it's important for us as police officers to hold each other accountable for what we do and our wrongs and our rights. And, you know, we don't believe that all law enforcement in this area, every officer that puts on this uniform is out here to wreak havoc and to violate rights. Not at all. I think the good majority of them are out here working hard and have the ideas and ideologies that we were sworn in with. However, when we do not stand up and speak out on officers that we see, whether they're our friends, our commanders, or our enemies that are violating rights, we are no good. You know, we're just as bad as the person that is committing those acts. So we've tried to push those things forward and expose corruption as an organization. That's what we do. We've been around since 1970s, early 60s, actually, officially founded in the 70s. And what we are about is being accountable to our police department and other officers, and most importantly, to our community.
And with the Ethical Society of Police Officers report, which I just read recently, could you talk about what are some of the reforms that your organization would like to see done in St. Louis particularly?
Yeah, some of the things that are important for us is the things that are just acknowledging and coming up with a plan of how we're going to not hire officers who have these biases, who are against LGBTQ, these officers that are against African Americans, that are against women, and setting up clear paths with hiring and doing more extensive hiring before these people are out there. They are all races. The issue is that a lot of times people look at bad officers and they see one race. Well, you know, there are Black officers who would be your worst nightmare as well. So what we want is to have a better hiring process where we eliminate these problem people before they become officers. And you must spend more time vetting them. We have a pre-academy recruitment program where anyone that wants to attend, they get eight to 10 weeks of training from us, 6 hours a week during that time, and we're with them and we get to know them in this environment. And sometimes the people that come through there, they're of all races. We've been very diverse. And sometimes some of them are not suitable for hire, and we're not going to recommend someone. We're not going to give someone a letter of recommendation if we believe, even if they come through our program and sit in the classes 6 hours a week for 10 weeks, we're not going to automatically recommend them. No, because we see them and we get to know them better. We just believe that the police department has to have a better hiring process, that, you know, our internal affairs division needs to stop taking complaints and listing complaints where the officer is unknown. Well, anyone that can see can tell you what race an officer is, can give you a physical description of the officer. Things like that are problematic when on actual complaints that some citizen has walked into our police department and said, hey, I was discriminated against. Hey, this officer was rude to me. And then we in turn take that complaint and list that officer as unknown. Well, you know something about that officer. You know what district, you know what their height, possible height, weight, you know, so that you can ultimately identify who these problem officers are. Things that we recommend are that all officers have body-worn cameras. Even our undercover officers, you have to have a body-worn camera. That we create employee resource and working groups that are geared towards identifying other problem employees, because the problems aren't just our police officers. We have civilian employees. We've recently fired 2 civilian employees that posted some very racist statements on social media. It's important to have these working groups where officers can feel more confident coming forward and exposing, and civilians exposing problem officers. We suggest better whistleblower protections because really there are none. You might be in the situation like myself and you have been charged with misconduct several times for speaking out against corruption. And you know, that's what you face in this job when you stand up. We are also about a review by the circuit attorney's office, a grand jury for all in custody deaths and officer involved shootings. You know, in our latest report, I think we list over like 20 examples of things, recommendations for change to improve the department for the community and our officers as well.
And when we talk about police reform like this, you kind of mentioned, you know, we need to look more at who we're hiring initially to be officers. What do you think really makes a good police officer? Who's a good candidate to become a police officer?
From any background, someone that's going to have integrity, that's not going to be swayed by the peer pressure around you. And what most people don't know with being an officer, it's kind of like, you know, at times like a high school environment, you know, popularity contest. These officers want to be liked by others. And it's important that it's not so much being liked, that you are going to abide by that oath, you know, to protect and serve all people, and that you're going to be fair, and that you have these qualities and that you're not swayed by them. And a lot of times what happens is that officers become, you know, jaded over time. They get in here into this job and they see other people taking shortcuts, and they in turn take those same shortcuts and it, leads to some of the behaviors that you see broadcast locally on the news and nationally about us on the news. So.
And when we talk about these protests going on here in the US, some people have said that these protests have, in some cases, caused police to pull back a little, and that might be partially responsible for the increase in homicide rates you see in a lot of big American cities now. And I believe you're a homicide detective, so you'd have experience with this. Do you think there's any truth to that? Do you think there's any connection between what's going on the streets right now with the protests and crime rates in major cities in the US?
I would like to see some verifiable proof of it, some data that shows that, and I haven't seen any. I think what you have historically are crime trends. Crime trends happen. Violent crime goes up, violent crime goes down. But a lot of times what people don't take into account with violent crime is, what is going on with drugs. If there is a new drug, if there is an increase, for instance, heroin overdose they've been out skyrocketed. And those are things that when you have people who are in a community that aren't receiving resources on a regular basis for addictions, in poverty, if you have high poverty, you're going to have crime. And a lot of times what is most connected to crime and violent crime in any area, any region is going to be poverty. So if there is a lack of jobs, you're going to have poverty, which means you're likely going to have a lot of violent crime there. And whether people are talking about the civil unrest and people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. People are fed up in communities all around the country and all around the world. And as far as crime happening, I can't, until I have some proof of that, some legitimate proof from a legitimate source, I can't necessarily agree with that sentiment.
And getting back to the Ethical Society of Police Officers, I think you said it dates back officially as an organization to the 1970s. Why was it founded initially, and what is its purpose overall?
So we were founded by African-American officers in the late 60s and officially in the 70s because of racial discrimination within our police department. And also because of the racial discrimination in our community that we saw occurring towards the community. And we were founded by this group of officers who decided they'd had enough and that they wanted to establish an association that was going to work towards improving the community and the police department when it came to racism. And that's why we were founded.
And the organization today is, what you mentioned, it issues reports, which, like I said, one was released recently that I had a chance to read. What else does your organization do for police officers and I guess citizens in the St. Louis area right now?
So we, on a daily basis, probably like today, we had maybe about between 6 and 10 emails and phone calls from citizens about problems they're having with law enforcement. A lot of times we are mediators and we are, we're the in-between in trying to connect people together. We have at times we have had to connect the chief to different activists to talk out problems that are occurring and disagreements. Or to connect activists who are looking to hold someone accountable for violent crime with someone that's in the circuit attorney's office or an officer or a commander. Those are the things that we do a lot of times. We do a lot of community service as well. We have a lot of community service projects. We put school pantries, we do that. Washers and dryers in schools. We do Pizza with a Cop. We do a lot of events like that for our children in our community, the unhoused. We work with a lot of organizations. In particular, one of our favorites is the Pot Bangers with Kathy Daniels, Mama Cat Daniels, and people like that. We do a lot of things, but we don't necessarily share those moments because they are so, when people are calling you, they're not calling you because they most times want to say, hey, great job. They're calling you because they're in distress. So a lot of those moments are not, we're not trying to get a pat on the back and be, oh, look at us, we're out here, we're working in our community, we're just doing the work. And handling those situations that most officers are avoiding, or handling those situations with our community, putting on a sweatshirt and some jeans and going out and handing out food to the unhoused, or clothing, just helping people move, doing things like that. That's what we do. But these moments are private. They are some of the worst moments in people's lives, and they're not to be broadcast. And they are things that we deal with on a regular basis. That's a part of what ethical is. Well, the main part of ethical that a lot of people don't recognize.
Well, Michael says we've got a lot of good questions coming in on our YouTube stream here. Michael, would you like to throw some out to us?
Yes, and thank you. This has been an outstanding session so far, and absolutely critical material being generated here. One respondent says, we recently saw a 13-year-old child with autism shot by police. Shouldn't officers, I think you may have addressed this in part at least, shouldn't officers be trained to recognize symptoms and how to de-escalate mental health related behaviors?
We actually do receive training, but a lot of times what people fail to recognize is that some of these officers have no business being officers. So even with knowing that you have a child who, and I saw that, it was awful. Just reading that story was awful. You have this child, you're called to this house for this child who's obviously in the middle of a crisis. And the family obviously told you that he was unarmed, that he had all of these things going on. And you have people who go in that receive 40 hours of training is not going to work. It's not going to work. If you have no history and no real background with encountering someone with autism and knowing what the signs are. And having that firsthand experience in that educational background. And so these calls, we are trained in de-escalation, but a lot of times officers, we are rewarded for being warriors. We receive rewards for being shot at. We receive awards for killing someone. You get the highest awards ever for enforcement. So it's not about being guardians anymore. That's long gone. So what people don't know is that, hey, I've been shot at in the line of duty. Guess what I received? An award for being shot at in the line of duty. I've never received an award for the hours that I've put in with helping people. Not from our police department. Police departments don't do that. Community does that. Community sees the importance of that. So when you have these officers that respond, and there's a 13-year-old boy who's in the middle of a mental health crisis and that needs something other than enforcement, you send an officer who has no skill set and no training in that, and 40 hours of training, again, is not the equivalent to a 4-year degree, or someone that's a doctor that has the doctorate in this field and understands it. It's a difference. And so you have them going to these calls and they're acting as enforcers, and sometimes it's just stupid behavior. Hey, this is a child. It can't justify shooting a 13-year-old boy like that. It was very sickening to read about that. But once again, we are taught de-escalation. It's taught all the time. Even after the murder of George Floyd, one of our board members took it upon himself to go out to different patrol divisions to teach de-escalation and to kind of reinforce why de-escalation is important. Because one person with George Floyd officer de-escalating would mean the difference in him being alive. And one person with this 13-year-old boy would be the difference in him being shot and his mother being devastated about what happened to him. But we do receive it. We do receive de-escalation training. We do receive crisis intervention training to deal with someone who's mentally ill. But once again, we're not social workers. We're ill prepared for it. And some of us are just, some of us are just evil. So, that's what you have, unfortunately. So.
As kind of a follow-up, there was a technical question that relates. Is this 40 hours of crisis intervention mandatory? Is it done every year? Does that get renewed? Do people have to get retrained on a systematic basis?
It's mandatory for everyone that enters the police academy. Everyone on our department should have had crisis intervention training. However, there's no follow-up with that. I got my 40 hours, I went to my training. I haven't received any follow-up, maybe about a decade or longer. So there's no, I get to choose what training I'm going to go to. So that's how that works, is that either you go to it or you don't go to it. Luckily enough, I studied psychology, so that helps me a little bit more than the average citizen. In college, I studied psychology, so I've had courses, not just, actual multiple courses on it. So it's different for me, but you don't have any follow-up courses with it. You have your 40 hours and there you go. The escalation training, that's something that goes on a little more frequently than following up with crisis intervention training after your initial 40 hours in the St. Louis City Police Department, that is.
Another question. How do we get the bad apples or bad actors from jumping from police department to police department and thereby avoiding the radar of their bad actions?
So the first thing is that this is one of our recommendations as well. One of the 20 plus ones there is that municipality jumping, what we call it is the Muni Shuffle, Muni jumping, is that police departments have to remove the officers' certifications. They have to apply to the peace officer standards of training, and that's called POST. Most states has a POST that reviews your license. And so what happens with that license is that in the state of Missouri, I want to say they have a total of 3 investigators for the entire state. So you have hundreds of police departments and you have hundreds of officers that are being fired, and they have 3 investigators to follow up on removal of their post license. So they're inadequately staffed. And I know nobody wants to fund law enforcement right now, but if we're going to actually expedite removing post licenses of officers that have no business being rehired somewhere else, that has to be a priority. So when we talk about getting rid of the bad apples, so officers need to speak up. They need to tell on other officers and other civilians as well, on other officers and civilians that have no business in law enforcement. So we have these bad apples that continue to move on and go to Muni after Muni, and leaving behind victims and mayhem and lawsuits and payouts. We have to, first off, identify them. We have to do a better job and put better protections in place for people who can report them. Because a lot of times you'll see, we don't like these officers. And the problem is that you'll have the same people complaining on the same people. And people see what happens to you once you complain on an officer, and their other officers are sometimes just fearful of doing that as well. So.
Thank you. Do you have personal feelings, or does the Ethical Society take a position on Missouri House Bill 46, which lifts city residency for police and other public workers?
So our opinion is that you should live wherever you want to live. I'm a lifelong city resident. For me, the bill doesn't affect me because I'm going to retire in the city. I lived in the city all my life. However, we believe that anyone should live wherever you want to live. There are most definitely the belief that there is this belief by the police department and the director of public safety and the mayor that is going to help with diversity. Well, there is no proof that it's of that at all. We don't feel that will necessarily occur. Diversity will increase. The police department hasn't made diversity a priority for the last, 10 years or longer. They haven't made it a priority, actually, probably ever. So the idea that we're going to have this influx of more diverse officers because they no longer have to live in the city. No, the police department knew in 13 when that 60% of African American officers were leaving the police department in their first 7 years. And they weren't leaving because of residency alone. They were leaving because there was a problem. There is a problem within our police department with fair treatment for everyone. So police officers, yes, they're leaving. Yes, residency is something that our board and our members believe. Hey, we believe you live wherever you want to live. That shouldn't be sanctioned like that. However, the reason that the governor and the chief included director of public safety are fighting for it, saying it's going to increase diversity. We'll wait to see that. Our thoughts is that it's actually going to decrease diversity. So.
Okay. One respondent says there have been some officers speaking out about negative consequences within the department for reporting fellow officers of misconduct. How can this be combated?
You have to have whistleblower protections in place. You have to, we have officers in the academy that come in and they're all taught, they're given this slate in front of them that's just, it's up to them to take all of this information that they're taught. And you have the opportunity to go into this job and fall back on that training that you received in the police academy every single day. And they choose not to do it. You know, it's a choice, but it's also a problem with protections there are no whistleblower protections. When I file a complaint, I go into officers and file that. I go to another officer to file that complaint. There is no in between, and you are exposed or identified. It is known there is no protection for you in place once you do it. And you oftentimes you can deal with death threats. You can deal with other employees liking the idea of you dying, a number of things, and with little repercussions for them. You know, when you would think that if you had another coworker that liked the idea of you bleeding out and dying on a call, that coworker would be terminated. No, they're not terminated. They're given a slap on the wrist, and you're forced to then in turn work with them. Or go to firearms training with them where you don't feel comfortable turning your back on them. I mean, would you want to turn your back or stand next to someone on the line that liked the idea of you bleeding out? Common sense would say no. But there has to be better protections in place for people that want to come forward to expose corruption within law enforcement. And a lot of times you are immediately identified. Once you do that, you expose yourself and you are isolated. You risk a lot of times people not showing up on your calls, not showing up when you need assistance. So it's a problem, but whistleblower protections have to improve. And that's something on a government level, the city level, that they must do that if they really care about stamping out police corruption. So,
thank you for that. My colleague in psychology, Marvin Tobias, has a comment and a question. His comment is that businesses have whistleblower protections.
mm-hmm.
And his question is, what are ideas regarding helping witnesses to violent crime who live under the threat of violent retaliation for talking to police?
So as a homicide sergeant, there's one case in particular where the witnesses were murdered in this case, and there is not enough money set aside for witness protection. I know the laws are slowly changing and they're trying to change this. Witnesses won't come forward. They oftentimes do not come forward because they are fearful. I've talked to a number of witnesses who said, hey, they provided me with a statement, but they were like, hey, I don't want to be in the police report. I want to tell you what happened, but I don't want to be in the police report. I don't want to have to go to court. I don't want to have to testify before a grand jury because somebody's going to kill me. I know of witnesses who have been murdered over the years. That's a strong possibility. So the witness protection protections in place, they have to be, there has to be more funding there, more money that's going to stabilize that, because a lot of these crimes could be solved if we're willing to protect the witnesses in these cases and prosecute the people who are then in turn trying to murder them and that harass them. And it's a difficult space to be in as a witness when you've come forward and risked your life, and then for your family to know that you're risking your life and then you are murdered. So.
Yes. Someone has written in, and let's check this figure. Are there 145 police officer vacancies in the city of St. Louis?
So it's probably about 120, somewhere around there. There are a lot of vacancies. A lot of officers leave for whatever reason. I'm retiring next week, so they're not retiring. A lot of them are leaving for better pay. Just they're leaving this field altogether. Yeah, there are a lot of open vacancies. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's around that number.
And that ties into a kind of a follow-up. Are the vacancies due to pay and benefits and working conditions, or is it because of the city residency requirement?
It's a combination of all of it. I think that more so for most people, it's the money. The pay is not comparable to St. Louis County, where we definitely do much more in St. Louis City than St. Louis County. The call volume for a lot of people, they can't manage it. When you're talking about 19 and a half years ago, when I was a patrolman in South Patrol, I was in the busiest car in the entire state of Missouri. You're talking about 19 and a half years ago. I was in car 339, and it was an overlay car, call after call after call, but it wasn't like it is now. And I would say that probably the increase in call volume is about 30%. And I couldn't imagine being a patrolman and being out there now with not enough, not so necessarily enough manpower. That's definitely a problem, but also that we're responding on calls that aren't police matters. If we eliminated the calls that weren't police matters, and directed them to city services where they should go, it would be a lot better. So officers are leaving for a combination of things: the call volume, the lack of pay, lack of diversity, lack of opportunity to advance. They're leaving for a number of reasons.
Can relations improve in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department as long as Jeff Ruerda continues to be the union officer?
I don't think so. I think it's impossible based off of some of the things that he's done. Anytime you have and here's the thing, we are considered the African American, for lack of a better word, police association. We're 97% African American. We have 325 members. The police association is much bigger. They have probably about 900 members that are officers. They have the majority of the members, like they say, and we're fine with that. However, collectively, when you have the police association condoning the use of the Punisher logo, we can't be okay with people pushing officers to vigilante justice. That's what the Punisher is for. We can't be okay with people that have language that mirrors that of the current president. That's a bunch of rhetoric that targets women, that in particular targets women of color as well. If we think we're going to then ultimately connect with communities of color with someone like him, I don't think we really can move forward with him, but he is their choice. And here's the thing, there are Black officers that are members of the police association. I'm not, but there are Black officers that are members of that, and they are aware of what he is. and some of them haven't stood up. So, it's a very difficult to move forward with police reform and changes and connecting to communities, especially those of color, when you have someone that's as divisive as he's been and untruthful at times about what's going on.
Here's another question. Will the mayoral race in February and April be centered around public safety and crime?
It should be. It should be. We're going to have to come up with a plan for this violent crime. We're going to have to come up with a plan for resources for people. It has to be centered around that. It has to be centered around, equitable pay. We have to have better pay for people in poverty, because the one thing we know is going to be connected with crime is going to be poverty. That's going to be a key factor with all violent crime in our city. And what we have now in place, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work that they have to do now, and whoever is elected or whoever remains in these positions, public safety has to be a priority. Police reform is a necessity right now, but so is addressing violent crime as well.
Yes. What is the Ethical Society's position regarding the Cure Violence Initiative, which was local, and Operation Legend, which was federal?
So our position with Cure Violence, we were all for it. We met with the, when it initially came here, we were on board with it. We still are. Any entity that wants to come here to address and help victims of violent crime or to deter violent crime, we should all be on board with that. As long as that's what they're going to do and what they remain focused on. As far as Operation Legend, don't know. I can say what my stance on it is that I'll tell a quick story. And unfortunately, my nephew was murdered. He was stabbed in August the 1st. My nephew is everything that a community would want from a young man, and he was murdered. And he was trying to defend someone else's life when he was murdered. And that process, I was away, thank goodness. It would have been my homicide scene. Thank goodness I was away, and that wasn't my homicide scene, but it was that of my detectives. And I have never in my lifetime received a call from the Attorney General. The Missouri Attorney General has never called me, never met him. And after my nephew was murdered on August the 1st, he called me, he reached out to me. And I felt that it was really strange. My nephew's family thought it was strange. And shortly thereafter, a couple of days after, Operation Legend is here. And it just feels like a PR move when you have victims of violent crimes and the families that are left behind with this. Politics can't be involved. It can't be a political statement when you're talking about violence. Violence has to, everyone from the left to the right, those in the middle, all have to come together to resolve that. And so my opinion about Operation Legend, I know that there were people who were contacted who didn't show up because they wanted to talk about cases, and people knew what it was. They felt as if the governor, if you really want to address violent crime, you're going to have to address why so many people are allowed to carry guns that should not carry guns. We believe in the Second Amendment. However, we also believe that you have to have a legitimate reason to have a gun, and not everybody should have a gun or have the ability to have access to one. And the Operation Legend, for me, I felt as if they were thinking that, I was going to be on board with Operation Legend, and no, I'm not going. My nephew is not going to be used for a political statement. My nephew's killer was located, and hopefully he'll be prosecuted, found guilty for his crime. But at the same time, I believe that Operation Legend, from a personal standpoint, was political. It is political. And if you really care about people in ending violent crime, how about addressing drug issues? We have to have conflict resolution, more conflict resolution centers. You must have a livable wage for people. A lot of the poverty issues associated with it, yeah, and there are some violent people in our community that Operation Legend, if they're going to assist to try to find these people, that would be great. But I can tell you that who found my nephew was a person that I called that's an officer that's a friend, my nephew's killer. I called him. He was out sick, recovering from an illness, made 2 phone calls, and the suspect turned himself in. And that's how we located the person that is accused of killing my nephew. So Operation Legend didn't help with that for, all the hoopla about it. So.
Can you speak, please, to the relationship of police officers and Kim Gardner, the city circuit attorney?
Mm-hmm. Some of it is strained, absolutely. Some of us see the bigger picture. Some of us see that she faces unbelievable odds simply for being a woman and also for being African American in that position. And you have the governor and legislators that are trying to, for the first time ever, with extreme levels of violence. In the 90s, we had more homicides than we do now. And the idea that they didn't attempt to remove authority from the circuit attorney at that time. The circuit attorney was white. And you have her, who's now a Black female. And some of the things that you see are obvious about race. They're obvious about political views. And they're not about public safety and helping victims and prosecuting victims adequately. But also on the other side is that some of the criticism as a homicide sergeant, I can say I have firsthand experience with assistant circuit attorneys not issuing cases where we've had video evidence, we've had more than enough probable cause. And we've later had convictions in these cases, some of these cases, that we've had cases that should have been prosecuted that they dropped the ball on. And I've had to write letters, phone calls, and demand justice on behalf of our victims. Until you are speaking to a mother, a father, a son, and you tell them, no, they're not going to prosecute the case. And you have all of this evidence that proves that they should prosecute the case, and they don't. And you have to have that hard conversation with the family. It's a very difficult one. It's a very angering conversation as well. However, when I've intervened, they've come back and done the right things by these families with these cases. But there have been times where they have absolutely dropped the ball. And that's a part of it as well. But I can also say under the last prosecutor, there were times where they absolutely dropped the ball. But she didn't receive this level of criticism that Kim Gardner is receiving. And some of it is fair, but a good amount of it is racially biased. It's steeped in just hatred sometimes. So.
Thank you for that. We've got another question. Why can't other non-lethal methods and weapons used to stop a person and get them into custody without pulling the trigger of a gun? And boy, I think of not only the autistic youth in recent news, but I'm thinking of just in a couple of weeks after Michael Brown was killed, Kajime Powell, mentally ill man, gunned down, and he had a knife and he was approaching the officer. And I'm wondering what could be done to avoid loss of life.
I think it's about who you hire. You have to have people that actually care, to not to seek all other options before they pull the trigger. I think our guns have become, it's been an easier outlet in these cases. I've been on calls where someone's had a knife. And, I grew up in North St. Louis, so, and I've seen some unbelievable things, and just my environment, my experiences, and how to stay alive and how to survive have shaped me on this job. I've been in fights with people and they've had guns, and, felt that I didn't need to shoot them, or my partner felt that they didn't need to shoot them. However, there's been times where I've been shot at, or where my partners were justified in shooting someone and taking someone's life. You have to see both sides of things and be fair about it. But there are definitely a lot of times non-lethal or fatal forms of reactions like the tasers. Some people don't like tasers. Well, the alternative to not having that taser is for some of these officers to go to a higher level of force, which is their gun. So, we have to find some balance in there. A lot of times both sides are just, oh, no, you're wrong here, you're wrong here. But sometimes you got to find that balance. And there are definitely less lethal forms of, now, would I have shot Kajimi Powell? No, I would have sat in my car, raised up my window. And if he would have come towards another citizen armed like that, then I would have to take the appropriate action, because I'm not going to let him harm someone else. Now, would I have shot him? I'm used to seeing people who are armed. I'm used to seeing people who are in the middle of a mental health crisis, because I grew up in that environment. I've survived growing up in those things, and a gun wasn't available for me growing up. It was about what I had here, how I talked to people, how you got out of those situations. But there are times when we have to use deadly force. But a lot of times officers who are not familiar, they're not from these communities, they don't have that level of restraint. They take those actions. So.
How is Officer Hall doing? He was the officer beaten by other officers during the Stockley protests.
And I can't talk about Officer Hall because that's a pending federal case, and Officer Hall deserves justice. That's all I can say. So.
This is a good one, and this speaks to a personal question that I have for you. Marvin Tobias from our psychology department asks, are you going to run for mayor?
I would never run for any political office. I vote accordingly. The elections that may not be important to other people, I vote in those and everything else. But I am not capable of going into politics. I have a level of, I just have no filter for it. I'm quite frankly, most times disgusted with most politicians. So I would not, I understand what people are asking of me. I would not. I wish whoever runs the best, but I think, I'm kind of disgusted with politics, but I'm going to vote like I'm supposed to, but I'm pretty disgusted with it. And I don't think I have that filter to maneuver. When nonsense is nonsense, I'm going to tell you that. And I expect us to do what's right. So, and that's not the reality with politics. So.
We are catching you at a transition point in your career. You're stepping down from your position. You're retiring from the police force. You're stepping down from your executive position at the Ethical Society. Could you tell us about your future plans?
So the future plans is we are moving out of state, and my husband took a job out of state in Florida. So we're moving there. It kind of happened suddenly. My goal was to attend law school at WashU, but that's out the door now. So moving out of state, we've talked, my husband and I have talked. I'm probably going to take a year off. I have to still take the LSAT in January. I'm going to take it and take a year off and just kind of, get back to things that are important, my health in this job. I have what now? Short hair. My hair was down to here, probably aged. In the last 6 years, I felt like I've probably taken 5 years off of my life doing this. Weight gain, all those things, it's time to focus on me, get healthy, and mentally and physically. So.
Well, maximum respect for your service, and we appreciate greatly your engagement with this forum, Democracy Days. On a personal level, I've seen you do some of that community work with Pot Bangers. I've seen you on a Pot Bangers Thursday night with Mama Cat and the crew. I've seen you at the Christmas party and the street party in September. And that relates to a question that's coming in, just a couple more questions, if you don't mind. What are some of your ideas for pulling communities together? I mean, I guess this goes beyond just your role strictly as a police officer, but certainly you have some ideas, I'm sure, on how greater community unity might be achieved.
So one thing that we've done quite a few times, and I don't think many police associations do them, we do community forums. With the pandemic, we haven't had one in about a year with the pandemic, and just really our board being kind of overwhelmed with everything that we have to do on a daily basis. Doing those, you have to be able to answer questions. There sometimes give the answer that people don't want to hear, and listen to criticism. So I think that is really important. If you're going to be transparent, you have to be, law enforcement has to sit up there. You have to take the criticism, you have to answer the questions, and you have to be honest with it. And sometimes being honest is something that the community may not want to hear, and they may want to hear. But those are the steps that you take. I think it's also important for police associations, police organizations to do reports, to do evaluations of their police department, to expose what's wrong, and at times also to expose what we are doing well. And I think those things are important with bringing the community together and showing up, not with your gun and your badge out, but just throwing on a t-shirt and some pants and going out and helping people at community service events. You know, nobody needs to know that you're a law enforcement officer. Just show up and do it, and continue to do those things.
We're getting some comments. Not only do some people want to see you as mayor, we're seeing Heather Taylor for Board of Aldermen, for state rep. I understand your position on the political arena. But yeah, I and others would love to see you in a position of authority like that. I think just about all of the questions that have come in, we have addressed. Yeah, I believe we have addressed the substance of people's questions. The comments box is blowing up with lots of great questions. And you've addressed them well. You know, as I hear you speak about the enormous stresses of your job and your colleagues' jobs, is there a sabbatical for police officers? Can you take time off?
Yeah, you actually can. You can take a year's unpaid leave as well. And there, like even now, I can retire, have the option of 2 years, before 2 years is up, is coming back. They'll probably change the policies because they probably don't want me back, but but yeah, you can. And I think that's part of the problem as well, is that you have to, in law enforcement, we don't do a good job of addressing mental health of law enforcement officers, and having checks and balances in place. I work in homicide. I'm a homicide sergeant. I think in my career, I've had, I want to say maybe 500 homicide scenes. So I've seen 500 families. I've talked to 500 families at the very least. And I have seen 500 victims of murder. And you think about, like, there is nothing that's in place there. If I didn't have the good sense to talk to someone on a regular basis, a counselor, about what I see, I think I would be nuts. You know, I think I would be nuts. And just imagine putting me out there in patrol with a gun under those circumstances. I'm grateful that I am stable, that I am healthy mentally, all of those things. But those things come with me being aware of the importance of my mental health. And a lot of times in law enforcement, it's not a priority. And we have officers who are suffering through unbelievable circumstances at times. You have people who are coming forward trying to expose corruption, and they're being beaten down, and they're stressed out. I have one right now, an officer who is, you know, nearly killed herself. So you have those things that are in place just by simply exposing corruption and being targeted and has no way out of it, you know. And it's important that law enforcement, we address mental health, because the #1 killer of officers is suicide. And now COVID-19. Suicide and COVID-19 are the leading causes of our death. And there has to be more done with that.
A lot of people are checking in with thanks for you for speaking today. Someone says, I have a ton of respect for Sgt Taylor, never knew her.
Thank you.
Thank you for your honesty and your perspective, says another one. And I would just echo that. This has been absolutely wonderful. So those are the questions from our comments box. Let me say thank you again. And
You're welcome.
Gabe,
Thank
do
you,
have
Sgt.
anything
Taylor.
else?
Welcome. Thank you.
All right. So I guess that's it. Thank you again, Sgt. Taylor. Maximum respect for all your great work as a police officer, as an advocate with the Ethical Society. This has been a great teachment in this last hour, and we appreciate your engagement with this forum in 2017 and also last year, 2019. Good luck with your next chapter. And I'm sorry on a personal level to see you go, but good luck in Florida.
Thank you. And to every student, don't ever give up, you know, be the change that we need. I'm counting on all of you. We all need you. So
Thank you.
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.